Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk with you today about a problem that most people are not aware of, and that is the danger of cannabis-induced psychosis. I believe that we have a silent epidemic in this country, and it's causing a great deal of pain for a lot of people. Last year, there were 540,000 cases of cannabis-induced psychosis in emergency rooms across the United States of young people under the ages of 25. In California alone, in 2019, there were 12,000 cases of cannabis-induced psychosis among senior citizens. In San Diego, one city, one hospital, they averaged 37 cases of cannabis-induced psychosis in the emergency rooms every day. That equates to 13,500 cases annually. Once again, in one hospital in one city. This is a huge problem throughout the United States. And in Boston, the problem is so big that the University of Boston Medical Center recently set up an entire separate program to treat people with cannabis-induced psychosis. And unfortunately, emergency rooms are exactly the wrong place to treat this condition. They're not equipped for it at all. So this is a big, big problem. Now, where do I get all this information? One of my favorite references is a paper titled Cannabis-Induced Psychosis Through the Lens of DSM-5. DSM-5 is the diagnostic and statistical manual used by all psychiatrists to diagnose and treat mental illnesses. And so there's an entire section in that book on cannabis-induced psychosis, and yet many people within the general public, certainly within the marijuana industry, do not believe that cannabis-induced psychosis exists. They don't believe that marijuana can make you crazy. And it certainly can and certainly does. And in that paper, they explain the various levels. They talk about cannabis-induced intoxication, then move on to cannabis use disorder, which is a fancy term for cannabis addiction, and that accounts for 30% of all users. But then they go on to discuss cannabis-induced psychosis in great detail and point out that all the studies show that between 10 and 15% of all marijuana users become psychotic. 10 to 15%. The FDA would never legalize any substance that causes 10 to 15% of all users to become psychotic. But with marijuana, we have the public legalizing it rather than the FDA, and that's an extremely dangerous situation. Now, that paper references dozens of studies. There are 69 references in that paper, and these studies are small, large, foreign, domestic, and all of them show the same results. Anywhere from 10 to 15% of all users become psychotic. One of the studies was in Sweden, where they followed 18,000 people for over 20 years. Another one was in Denmark with over 6,000 people. Some of the studies are laboratory studies with only 50 people. They all show the same result. So I just pointed out that we have a huge problem with cannabis-induced psychosis in our country, but I've neglected to define exactly what cannabis-induced psychosis is. Most people don't really fully understand what it means to be psycho. They just think somebody is acting a little bit crazy. But the technical definition is that a person with psychosis has delusions, hallucinations, and paranoia. So a person with cannabis-induced psychosis, after using high doses of marijuana, high doses of THC, tends to have delusional thoughts. They have hallucinations, which can either be auditory or visual, meaning they hear things or see things that aren't real. And then they experience paranoia, which is sometimes extreme. And there's a reason that this happens. Most people believe that marijuana just makes people calm and makes them happy. And in many cases, that's true. As I pointed out, cannabis-induced psychosis happens to about 10 to 15% of all people. And there's a very good reason for it. People who have naturally occurring paranoid schizophrenia have an excess of anandamide in their brain. Now, anandamide is a naturally occurring cannabinoid, and it's very similar chemically to THC. So just in the same way that excess levels of anandamide cause psychotic thoughts in paranoid schizophrenics, THC causes psychotic thoughts in people with cannabis-induced psychosis. Now, the difference is major in that the THC, although chemically similar to anandamide, is actually much stronger and lasts much longer, and therefore making cannabis-induced psychosis harder to treat than paranoid schizophrenia. So this is a big issue. Now, these cases can be either acute or chronic. In the acute cases where maybe a young person smokes too much weed on one particular weekend, they start having some crazy thoughts and it gets a little scary. Those acute cases can typically be treated with antipsychotic medications such as risperidone or olanzapine. However, in cases where the patient has been using marijuana heavily for months or years, and the THC levels just build and build and build in their system, then the psychosis can be extreme and it can last for a very long time. It's not uncommon that it lasts for months or even up to a year. And during that time, the person is in extreme danger because of these thoughts. So one thing that's important to note also is that even when the person then goes off marijuana, the psychotic thoughts can last 2 to 4 months after they stop using. So, and then they tend to start getting better after that. So this is an extremely dangerous condition. Now, why does this happen? I just explained the anandamide issue, but there's an excellent psychiatrist named Eric Messamore who did a YouTube video, and I put the link to this video in the description, where he explains in great detail for about an hour exactly what happens and why this is causal. One of the arguments of the marijuana industry is that, well, yes, people become psychotic, but they were going to be psychotic anyway. They were mentally ill anyway. So correlation is not the same as causation. Well, Dr. Messamore refutes that and gives the scientific reasons why THC causes cannabis-induced psychosis. Similarly, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation put out a great video called "This Is Your Brain on Pot," and I've put a link to that video also in the description, where they describe how high levels of THC make things in your brain literally switch. And you go from a calm euphoria to being extremely paranoid, anxious, and psychotic. And this is because it changes the glutamate and GABA receptors in your brain. So this is all scientifically proven. It's all very clear. So now let's talk about who is in danger. There are two high-risk groups for cannabis-induced psychosis. First is anyone who either has a mental illness or has a genetic predisposition to mental illness in their family. Say, perhaps they have an uncle that was bipolar or an aunt who was a paranoid schizophrenic. And in those people, they have an extremely high risk, and they should never use marijuana. The second high-risk group is people who have used marijuana heavily as teenagers. And among that group, the marijuana has done permanent damage to their brain because they were using when they were young. And so those two groups make up roughly half of all cases of cannabis-induced psychosis. The other half are people that are mentally well, have no family history of mental illness, did not use weed as a kid, and yet they still become psychotic. And nobody knows for sure why. They've already identified approximately 130 genes that do make you susceptible to cannabis-induced psychosis, but certainly there could be more. So we're looking now at, as I said, 10 to 15% of all users becoming psychotic, and half of those are predictable, the other half are not. And one of the things Dr. Messamore found was that he was getting a lot of new patients that are mentally well, have no family history of mental illness, were never drug users, and he was seeing people like 40-year-old male engineers becoming psychotic on marijuana, and they were extremely difficult to treat. The antipsychotic medications were not working, and that's actually normal. That paper that I mentioned, Cannabis-Induced Psychosis Through the Lens of DSM-5, describes that and explains that that's what should be expected. So people with cannabis-induced psychosis are in extreme danger. This condition destroys their mind and their entire life. It destroys their relationships, their families, their careers, their education, their future. And there's a huge potential of suicide and homicide. It's been shown that cannabis-induced psychosis increases the risk of suicide 5 to 6 times. People with bipolar disorder, for instance, already have a huge suicide rate of approximately 10%. Cannabis-induced psychosis in those bipolar patients increases that to 40%. It's just horrifying. Now, why are they having these? Why are they suicidal and homicidal? The reason is that these psychotic delusions are extremely bizarre, extremely dangerous. They're terrifying to the patient. And then, so the patient is believing that their family members, often their children or their spouse or their parents, are actually demons or the devil or witches, and that the demons or devil or witches are actually trying to kill them in their paranoid state. And so as a result, they kill the demon. They often hear God telling them to kill the demon. This is common. I've read over 400 murder cases just like this, and they're all very similar. They all have very similar psychotic delusions, similar paranoia, and strangely, the weapons are similar too. Almost all of these cases are stabbings, and it's very common. You'll see a case where somebody stabs the other person 40 times, 60 times, 100 times, and even occasionally with dismemberment. I mean, incredibly gruesome. They use swords, machetes, axes, and knives. And this is very frightening. Their second most popular weapon is vehicles. There are many cases of vehicular manslaughter, and there are some cases where they do both, where they stab the victim and then run them over with the car. There's also a paper, which I've included in the description as well, that shows that almost all of the mass shooters in recent history have either had cannabis-induced psychosis or cannabis-induced paranoia. And this includes school shooters like Nicholas Cruz. I listened to his entire testimony when he was being interviewed by the detective, and he kept talking about demons telling him to kill, steal, and destroy. And of course, he was a heavy marijuana user. It was very similar with Salvador Ramos, who shot all the kids in Uvalde, Texas, and the parade killer, Robert Crimo, in Highland Park, Illinois, also psychotic on marijuana. Same with Darrell Brooks in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So there's an extreme danger here, and I typically say there are only 2 words that can describe cannabis-induced psychosis, and those words are terror and horror. And the terror is the patient is terrified. The person in the psychotic condition is terrified that these demons and the devil are after them. And then as a result of that, they inflict horror upon their family members and friends and victims. So this is a serious, serious condition, folks. And as I said, it's huge. I just quoted you all these statistics. And I've read over 400 murders, and I'm seeing them happening over and over and over again. There was a recent case in Rockford, Illinois, where a young man named Christian Soto, I believe he was 21 years old, went to a party on a Saturday afternoon. And one of his friends offered him some marijuana. They started smoking together. And he almost instantly became psychotic on marijuana, stabbed his friend, ran over him with a car. Then the boy was still alive and ran into his house. So Christian chased him into his home, killed his friend and his mother, stabbed them to death, then came out and stabbed 5 more people to death and killed a young lady with a baseball bat, all within 20 minutes. And of course, when this happens, people jump to conclusions and they always say, oh, the marijuana must have been laced. No, it wasn't laced. He was sharing that marijuana with his friend and other friends. None of the other kids became psychotic. He became psychotic. So it wasn't some foreign substance that caused this. It was the THC. And I just explained to you why THC causes cannabis-induced psychosis. As I said, there's hundreds of murders like this. I'm going to list several of them in the description. There was a recent case in Southern California where a young lady named Bryn Spedker, 27 years old, beautiful young lady, and just a good all-around person. She had just finished her degree in medical school in audiology, and she got a job offer in Southern California. So she moved out there, started dating a nice young man, and he was a heavy marijuana user, or I should say a daily marijuana user. And as they were dating, he kept trying to convince her to smoke marijuana with him. She didn't really want to, but over time, she finally said, well, sure, I'll give it a try. And so she took a hit off of his bong and then said, well, I don't really feel anything. So he said, well, let's make it stronger. And we put in more marijuana, fired it up, toked up the bong to where the bowl was incredibly full of smoke, opaque, white, and said, here, take a hit off of this. So she did. And according to her testimony, 5 to 10 minutes later, she ran into the bathroom screaming. And she was screaming because she was having psychotic delusions that demons were tormenting her, and that those demons were telling her that she was in hell, she was dead, and that the only way she could come back to life was to kill someone. And this torment was so strong that she then ran out of the bathroom into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and stabbed her boyfriend, Chad, 108 times. Of course, he was dead, and she continued stabbing him. She then stabbed her dog to death. She had a service dog because she herself was hearing impaired, and she stabbed the dog to death. And by the time the police came, she was in the process of stabbing herself in the throat. Fortunately, they got there in time and she survived. But I want to point out that this is a fairly normal case of cannabis-induced psychosis. It's normal for them to hear the voices of demons. And a few months after reading about that case, I read another one about a young man in Ohio. And this is on the website called everybrainmatters.org. And the whole purpose of that site is to show the dangers of marijuana. And in that case, the young man was a veteran who had just come back from serving our country. And he had some PTSD, went to a marijuana dispensary, I believe in Ohio, bought some marijuana, smoked it with his girlfriend, seemed fine. They enjoyed it, calmed him down. A few days later, he went back and bought more. Came home, smoked some more with his girlfriend. This time, he had the same psychotic delusion that Bryn Spedker had. He started believing that there were demons tormenting him. In this case, the demons were in the television. And these demons were tormenting him, telling them that he was dead, that he was in hell, and that the only way he could get out is to kill someone. He then ran into his bedroom, grabbed his pistol, and shot his girlfriend and his 2 dogs. Fortunately, the young lady survived. But once again, the only thing odd about that case was that he used a firearm. Most of them, as I said, are stabbings. And very, very sad. So yes, there's hundreds and hundreds of cases like this. And what I find is, I believe there's many, many more. I'm going to explain why. I see cases here in Florida all the time where they're very similar, multiple stabbings. Young man in the Jacksonville area near St. Augustine, 14 years old. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but he had been smoking marijuana for about 2 months with his friends, and he was hearing demons telling him to kill. And one evening, he was smoking weed with one of his buddies and a young cheerleader named Tristan Bailey. And he started walking her home about 1 a.m. and then stabbed her 114 times. Next morning, he didn't remember having done it. Why did he do it? He was hearing demons. And he would not have been hearing those demons if he had not been smoking marijuana. There was another case recently, Giancarlo Saponte in South Florida, veteran, about 40 years old, had a very happy family, beautiful wife and children. And he stabbed his wife 27 times and threw the baby in the pool to die. And his neighbors said that he was a good man. He loved his family, took good care of them. I'm sure he did. I have no doubt that man was a good husband and good father. But because he used marijuana to treat his PTSD, he became psychotic, and they're dead. And I see cases like this all the time, and they're attributed to mental illness. The person is determined to be incompetent. They're determined to be psychotic. The psychiatrist will diagnose them and say they were psychotic, they were paranoid schizophrenics, and not attribute it properly to the marijuana. And this is an extreme danger. It's something we have to stop doing. I find that most of the psychiatrists here in Florida at the Baker Act facilities are not at all familiar with cannabis-induced psychosis. They don't know how to diagnose it, and they don't know how to treat it. And there's a reason for that. This is a fairly new phenomenon. And the reason this is a fairly new phenomenon is that most of the research that I'm talking about, most of the papers I've read have been since 2017. There's some work before that. In fact, there's a very good paper in 2015 that says you should never give it to PTSD patients because it makes them worse and makes them more violent. I can put a link to that paper in the video as well. So this is a fairly new phenomenon, and the psychiatrists say, well, it's hard to diagnose because we can't tell the difference between the psychosis from paranoid schizophrenia versus the marijuana. But there are distinguishing factors, and the primary one is if the patient is never psychotic when they're off weed, but they're always psychotic when they're on weed. That makes it very clear that this is a case of cannabis-induced psychosis, and I see many cases like that. So I've talked about cannabis-induced homicides, and I did mention the increased risk of suicides as well, and I want to go back to that. The CDC website states, marijuana use has also been linked to depression, social anxiety, thoughts of suicide, suicide attempts, and suicide. This is extremely common, particularly among teen users. Now, it's interesting to note that most of the murder cases that I've read are people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and even 50s. However, most of the suicide cases I've read are teenagers, people, 16, 17, 18, 19. And there was a young man named Johnny Stack, handsome young man, very smart, good kid, but became a heavy marijuana user as a teenager. And he ended up committing suicide, jumping off of a building due to his psychotic delusions. His mother was a woman named Laura Stack, and she has developed a great website that you should check out called Johnny's Ambassadors. And she's basically has committed her life now to educating young people about the dangers of marijuana. I want to point out another source that is incredibly important, and that is a website called everybrainmatters.org. Everybrainmatters.org. It's run by a woman named Aubrey Adams. Both her son and her husband have suffered from cannabis-induced psychosis, and it was extremely destructive to their lives. And she now has probably the most comprehensive website on all the dangers of marijuana, not just psychosis, but also cannabis-induced hyperemesis syndrome, addiction, and basically brain development issues. And Aubrey has now worked with over 1,000 families of patients with cannabis-induced psychosis. And in fact, I just received a text from her this morning about a family in Seattle where the son has cannabis-induced psychosis and they need help. The laws are such that it's very difficult to get help for a family member, particularly if they're 18 or over. If the kids are under 18, you can forcibly get them treatment. If they're 18 and up, you can't. And of course, they don't believe they're psychotic, so it's extremely difficult. I want to point out there's another website called Parents Opposed to Pot, POP, and another one called Moms Strong. And in all these cases, these are run by families whose kids have died because of cannabis-induced psychosis. Treatment. Now, I mentioned that the treatment is extremely difficult because THC is stronger than anandamide. The antipsychotic medications are not as effective, and the psychosis is worse and it lasts longer. It's very comparable to meth-induced psychosis, and that's something I want to point out that I neglected to mention. Yes, we have a mental health problem in this country, but it's greatly exacerbated by drug use, and most psychoses are drug-induced. Some are, I believe it's somewhere around 1.8% of the population become paranoid schizophrenics. Somewhere around 4% are bipolar. And that accounts for the naturally occurring psychoses, but the rest of them are drug-induced psychoses. And 47% of all drug-induced psychoses are caused by cannabis. That's huge, almost half. 32% are caused by meth, and 21% by all other psychoactive drugs combined. So things like PCP, mushrooms, LSD, etc. So really the first question to ask when somebody's psychotic is it weed or is it meth? Because that's almost 80% of the cases right there. And it's usually weed. So, but I find that law enforcement is not really up on this. The judiciary is not up on it. The psychiatrists in the Baker Act facilities are not familiar with it. And so we're in a really strange situation here. I personally find that every time I've been to the emergency room myself, I ask the local emergency room doctors, hey, have you seen any cases of cannabis-induced psychosis? And their answer is always, oh yeah, every day. They said we had 2 last night. That's a common response. So what is the proper treatment? Unfortunately, it's strictly abstinence. What I find is, from the cases that I've read and studied, that risperidol helps a little. Olanzapine's a little better than that. And what it does is take the edge off, but it doesn't make the psychotic thoughts go away. So the patient becomes more calm. Their behavior is better, but they're still having these psychotic thoughts. And it takes a long time to recover. So what I want to point out here is the short term. What we have in Florida is a Baker Act where the person is involuntarily sent to treatment, but it's only for 3 days. That's completely inadequate. You cannot treat patients in 3 days. You can't just give them some antipsychotic meds and send them home. They have to go through the withdrawal phase. And during that withdrawal phase, the psychosis actually worsens. It can worsen for months. And so it's very common that treatment takes 6 months. And they need to be in a safe, locked down facility that is familiar with treating cannabis-induced psychosis. That's very hard to find. There's a good one here in Florida called Life Skills South Florida. And the medical director there is Dr. Daniel Bober. He has a great deal of experience treating cannabis-induced psychosis. He came out of the program at Yale. And the predominant guy in the field of cannabis-induced psychosis is from Yale. His name is Dr. Cyril D'Souza. He did a lot of the pioneering work in that. So this is a very big problem that we have to deal with, and it affects every aspect here. The state is not prepared to have more people becoming psychotic. The country is not prepared. So we need we need our police to understand it. We need the judiciary to understand it. We need all the medical professionals to understand this. And we need proper treatment facilities to handle it rather than releasing these people out into the public while they are in danger, and then they're a danger to others as well. So I want to point this out. And because of all this danger, I feel it's incredibly irresponsible to legalize marijuana anywhere. It's dangerous. Here in Florida, we have a medical marijuana program, and I'm very opposed to that. But to legalize it recreationally is even worse. And we've seen what that does in other states, particularly Colorado, Washington State, and California. And the decline in those states since they have legalized marijuana recreationally is absolutely huge. There's plenty of reports on the increased number of people who become psychotic, increased crime, and it's just overall a devastating thing to do. And yet people love their weed and they want it, so they keep voting for it. So I am personally opposed to legalization of marijuana anywhere for any reason. And I want to give you some perspective on this. You know, when I'm talking about medical use versus recreational use, there is one drug approved by the FDA that contains THC. It's called Marinol, and it was approved to treat seizures, such as epileptic seizures. And it's very effective. And it's the dose approved by the FDA is 2.5 milligrams of THC twice a day. So a total of 5 milligrams per day. So this brings me to a really important topic, and that is that of THC levels, concentration levels. There have been several attempts here in Florida to reduce the THC levels that are legal, even in medical marijuana, and those continue to be shot down. So when I was young, the THC levels in standard marijuana, street weed, was 2 to 3%. Now, in the smokable medical marijuana, it's 20 to 35%. So 10 times stronger. In the capsules, concentrates, oils, it's typical that those are 90% THC plus. And the dosing is left 100% up to the patient, not to the doctor. The patient gets to choose the type, the form, the route, and how much they use and how often they use it. That is not like any other medical pharmaceutical. And yet, this is what's allowed in our medical program. Now, when I talked about the THC levels, so the Marinol has 2.5 milligrams of THC per dose twice a day, so 5 milligrams total. Dr. Messamore that I mentioned says, well, the safe level seems to be about 12 milligrams a day, depending on the patient. And yet, there are patients here that start off at 40 milligrams a day. There are capsules available that are 50 milligrams a day, and some patients are taking 2, 3, 4 of those capsules. So they're taking 100 milligrams a day, 200 milligrams a day. I've seen and read about people taking 400 milligrams. The FDA approved 5. It's insane to let people use 100 milligrams a day, let alone 400 milligrams a day. It's much too dangerous. Like the doc says, 12 milligrams a day for most patients is safe. For most patients, not for everybody. So thank you all. I really appreciate your time and attention. Be safe. Be careful about this. It's dangerous. Don't think it's safe to let your kids use marijuana. It's never safe. Thank you.